All right, everybody, thanks for tuning in. It's Patrick Bartley here, and today we're going to be looking at something that I guess a lot of people haven't talked about yet. But today we're going to be covering definitive, at least the first in this meta right now, the meta that has been existing for the past 30 or 40 years, I guess, with elements of some holdover from a meta from about 80 years ago during the bebop meta. And before that, of course, in the trad meta, which is a completely different meta, the very last kind of major patch update we had was the bebop era. You could make an argument that, fusion or maybe post-bop is its own meta, but that was kind of a short-lived meta that ended up getting fused into, right back into a resurgence and a renaissance of the old bebop meta that we still use today. So today we're going to be talking about a competitive chords tier list. So just for full disclosure and a disclaimer for everybody, remember, this is a competitive tier list, so all chords are viable in casual play. I just want to say, as in my experience, as a competitive jazz player over the past 12, 13 years, this is what I have seen as the definitive list from my experience. Now, everybody's going to have their own list, but I think that with the way that I'm explaining it, you'll hopefully be able to see exactly why I rank these. So let's go ahead and talk about what these tiers mean before we actually get into it. So in reference to the chords, we're going to be looking at what are the chords that have the most application or the most power versus the ones that need a little more work or more support. So, and for all intents and purposes, we have no idea if any of these chords are ever going to get any kind of balance patch. Because as of right now, these chords have been what they were and how they've been for the past 100-something years, and they have not changed. We've gotten slight balance patches, I guess, after the 1960s when we started adding certain extensions that were not really present before or that were stayed away from until they were patched in. But then people, of course, started experimenting. Some people started hacking. Like, beware of hackers. There are some hackers that like to, adjust tunings of chords. They like to adjust the tunings of certain notes to kind of create different types of illusions for chords. But we don't talk about those because hackers are not really good for competitive play. So no chord microtonal hackers in this situation. That's really good for the people who can do that. However, this is for purely competitive play. So let's go ahead and explain the tiers. So in order, we have the bottom tier. Normally it's kind of, between, I guess, S, as we see right here. You see a letter S right there. But usually it's from S, A, B, C, D, whatever, and then maybe a F tier, whatever. But in this case, I renamed the letters to something that kind of more fits and explains the chords for their specific situations. Because saying something is like D tier, C tier, whatever, A tier, doesn't really explain a lot. Because sometimes it's not just, oh, this chord is bad or this chord is good. There's reasons why. So instead of explaining every single one, I wanted to make tiers that better represented exactly how the chords can be in their function. So let's look at the bottom. In D tier, what I renamed to 2 weak by itself. That means that this chord is good. Because the chord is good here. However, because all chords are good. But it has very, 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 very limited function. Meaning that, like, if you just play the chord by itself, there's no tonic, there's no whatever, you'll see what I mean when I say that. And you might already be able to know what I'm saying by me saying that. But basically, you get what this means. 2 weak by itself. It needs support. Basically, if you put this chord out on the field, with no support, it's either too slow, it either needs, it can't get its ult fast enough. It's very slow recharge time. Especially when it's time to respawn to get back onto the field, it just can't really do anything. So that's why, even though it can be used with a good enough team, by itself in solo play, this chord doesn't really work. So that's what this tier is for. Situational means that it's okay. You can use the chord, right? The chord is going to be decent when you're on the field. However, it's very situational. So you kind of have to skill diff people in order to use this chord in solo play. Skill diff means, like, there's a skill difference. Like, if you're an advanced player playing against a more beginner player, well, then any of these chords that are in this tier are going to be fine because you know how to use them. But for the average person that are going to be in the same tier, right, the problem is that if someone is using a chord in the situational tier and somebody else is using one solid support multi-purpose tier, there's more often than not, the team that's using the chords in this tier are gonna outplay this if they're in the same skill bracket. But anyway, moving on to the usable but limited function. This is the first kind of viable chords for solo play or just in general when building a comp around these chords. These are the first chords that you can use that will basically yield you decent results that have application. However, they're very limited in function. Meaning that these chords in this tier can't really they kind of stay where they are, right? Chords that are in this tier kind of just stay. Like you can play them and they're fine, but the next destination, moving back and forth between different chords in a progression, is very limited. You're going to notice that basically when we're talking about building a comp, chords can't exist by themselves, right? The chords in jazz, the reason why the meta is what it is, all chords in jazz are going to be based on a meta around progression, right? You need the chords that can move in a progression. These chords that are in this tier are fine. They're like decent. If you play them, no one's going to have a problem with it. They're just not as powerful in a progression, basically. That's basically what we're talking about. So the chords that are here basically can't move as much, but they're decent. They're okay. So solid support multi-purpose. This is a really good tier. This is basically the first, this tier is going to, just spoiler alert, this tier is going to have the most chords in it. The reason why is because there's a lot of chords that are really good support. They're really good within a progression, but also multi-purpose is in they can function both as a support chord and a standalone chord that you can use in solo play. So these chords can hold their own, right? These chords can hold their own in any situation, which is good. They can hold their own there. That's what they want. Now, the only thing that keeps these chords from being OP in S tier, which we'll talk about, is the fact that they still have slight limitations that prevent them from being used in every situation. And the easiest tier to explain is what's OP, the S tier. The chords that are in this tier basically are just the most overpowered chords. They can be used in any situation, literally any situation. There's no situation that they can't handle. The meta revolves around these chords, right? And if you've been playing competitive jazz long enough, then you can obviously understand what these chords might be already. I might not even have to say, but these chords in competitive play are the ones that are the most overpowered. Basically, they're way overtuned. Everyone uses them. They're great. They can be used as a standalone, solo play, or they can work well in a team. Basically, if you pick these chords in any comp, you're always gonna win. There's nothing that these chords can't do in any given situation. So, but anyway, let's hop right into it, shall we? So the first chord the first tier we're gonna be looking at is we're gonna go from the bottom to the top, and this will be ordered. Okay. So let's start with the 2 week by itself tier. So this tier, like I said, I'll just do a little brief explanation again. Basically, this is the tier where it's the bottom tier. This is just gonna say it. This is the tier where any chord that goes here is a chord that just is too weak to stand on its own. And when analyzing chords within the perspective of the jazz meta, thirds and sevenths win, right? Being able to resolve and being able to hold a tonic are basically the most important things. There's temporary tonics, as in, if you're in a key of B flat major, right? And like you do a 2-5 into E flat. Well, E flat is not the tonic, it's the 4, but it's a temporary tonic. So dominance can kind of go anywhere, diatonic or chromatic, whatever. So for all intents and purposes, we're not talking about diatonic or chromatic function. We're talking about the general purpose of the chord by itself. So the first chord to go into the 2 week by itself tier is, I don't know, again, some of y'all might be upset about this, but this is where we're going. Half diminished. This is the one chord that has always been a point of contention in the jazz meta. All of the metas, half diminished has been a troublesome chord. The reason why half diminished is a troublesome chord is because it has two things going against it. One of those things is the fact that it's well, first of all, half diminished means that it has all the properties of diminished in the beginning, right? If you just make it a triad. If it's a triad, it's a diminished chord, which, again, spoiler alert, it's a very good chord. It's one of the best chords in the entire jazz meta. However, it's stunted by the fact that it has a 7, and the 7 is minor. So the fact that 7 is minor means that the 7, it's cool. The 7s like to resolve down to thirds. However, this chord as a half diminished lends itself to want to be minor, which means it's stuck to comps that want to build themselves around minor progressions. Now, again, in casual play, you can do whatever you want. You can have if you want to have a half diminished go to a regular 5, that's fine. However, the problem with half diminished chord is that it lends your ear to minor. So because it lends your ear to minor, it's very easy to read. It's a hard read chord. And also, because it has a flat 5, and a minor third, it doesn't really stand on its own. It's naturally a 2. It wants to go to a 5. Every single note, first of all, the 7th can resolve down to a third, but the minor third in this chord doesn't go anywhere. In a 2-5-1, the minor third stays the same in the 5. The 2, think about it. If you have a C half diminished or a C minor 7, whatever, C minor 7, the third of C minor is the 7th of F7. That means that it doesn't change. And with no change, it's just staying there. It's too slow. And anytime that there's no change in a chord, then you lose that speed, that edge in being able to resolve quickly. And you need to be able to resolve quickly if you want to play in the jazz meta. You have to keep up. That's the problem. If you take a half diminished chord, put it in the wild, you can say, I'm going to create some kind of Locrian thing. But if we're talking about the meta, remember, the jazz meta jazz is a spectator sport. It's not just for you. So if you want to build a comp around what something that's going to sound good, well, you can't play half diminished as a tonic and expect it to be understood. You can't. So if you can't play it as a tonic and it has very limited use case as a 2 chord, well, you're kind of stuck with very specific applications. So it's not a bad chord. It's not a bad chord. It's never been a bad chord. None of the chords on the list are bad. Every chord is viable. However, in the wild, in solo play, you gotta rely on your teammates to back you up. And the half diminished chord will not be good on its own unless you can have the help of for example, another chord on this list that we're going to talk about, a 7 flat 9. A dominant 7 flat 9 is the perfect support. You have to have, that's the way it's, the half diminished chord is going to set up that dominant 7 flat 9. And without it, it won't work. So that chord needs other chords in order to be enabled. Otherwise, it just is stuck there. So that's the reason why it's too weak by itself. It's a good chord. It can be used to, enhance any of you can substitute it for whatever, but because it naturally lends itself to being minor and it cannot be used as a tonic, it's just stuck here. It's just how it is. So this is the only chord in the 2 weak by itself, because every other chord out here basically can work in some way on its own. So, all right, this is the only chord that's in this tier. Let's talk about the situational tier. The situational tier has also 1 chord, because based on these, there's not a lot of places that the chords can go, because there's not a lot of chords. So the situational tier is the tier where it's usable, but you want to, it depends on the situation, because there's some properties of this chord that I'm about to talk about that make it kind of problematic in solo play. So the minor 13. We got to talk about the minor 13. The minor 13 chord is kind of it's complicated, man. It's complicated because this chord is one of the most recent chords to show up in the jazz meta, and the most recent the most recent application and appearance that we've seen from, not most recent, sorry, let's say most recent. The earliest time that we see the minor 13 used in the jazz meta is when the cool meta, I guess you can call that the last part of the bebop patch, which is when Kinda Blue came out. Kinda Blue was kind of like, that was the ushering into the new meta, right? Kind of the meta we're in right now has been vastly influenced by the Kinda Blue cool jazz meta. And when the modal meta came out, this chord was a lot higher. I'd say back then, this chord could be like up here. Basically here. Not here, but basically here. But right now, in the meta that we're in right now, minor 13 just doesn't have the same power that it used to. So minor 13 is problematic for one reason. I don't know if you all can guess. If you can't guess, I'm going to tell you why it's problematic. The minor 13 has all of the great qualities that a good supportive chord should have, as in it's a minor chord, right? So if you just look at the root, third, and the 5 and the 7, that's great. It can stand by itself. The 7th resolves to a third, so it can be used in the 2-5-1 composition. That team comp is a classic comp. However, when you want to resolve, you can't resolve too quick. If you overextend your resolutions, if you overextend your chords, you're going to be wasting your team resources before your team has a chance to catch up. You don't want to resolve too quick, right? The problem with resolving too quick in anything, this is something that a lot of beginners in the jazz meta, or even intermediate players, some advanced players, they got to get with it too, but usually beginner and intermediate jazz players, one of the things that they struggle with is understanding resolution timings. And it's okay, because timing your specials or your ults, right? Timing your ultimates with your team can be something that is hard to understand at first. But if you look at examples from, again, the great players, the top 500, the top players, top teams, you'll understand how they can use this. And one of the things that makes a resolution powerful is the anticipation of the resolution. So in other words, being able to fake out your opponent until the resolution comes up. There's a lot of people that delay resolutions too. Delaying a resolution can have its power, but again, it's something that top level players are the ones that are able to do the best. But in this situation, the minor 13 has one glaring flaw. If you take away the 13, even the 11, but if you take away the 13, you have a perfectly usable 2 chord. But if you put the 13, well, here's the thing. Let's talk about C minor, for example. The root, 3rd, 5th, and 7th of C minor is C, E flat, G, and B flat. Perfect. You got a 3rd and the 7th. The 3rd can stay. It's not top tier, but the 3rd can stay. It becomes the 7th, and the B flat goes down to the A because it's in the rule of resolution. That's the rock, paper, scissors meta of chord resolutions, right? That's the 7th goes down to the 3rd of the next chord. What is the 3rd of the next chord? Okay, in a 2-5-1, you have C minor 7 to F7. The 3rd of F7 is an A. So what happens when you put the A in the chord? Okay, let's go ahead. We know that the 1, 3, 5, and 7 is C, E flat, G, and B flat. Okay, what about the extensions? The extensions was a patch update that the bebop players were kind of, it started off as a bug, right? Extensions started off as a bug that the devs patched in right around this era that we're talking about, which went into kind of the more, the cool school, what we know as the kind of blue, as we can call it, right? That was eventually patched in. Bill Evans was one of like the premier players, right? He was kind of the top meta player of the extensions meta. But bebop, there was a bug that we found in bebop. So here's the reason why the bebop players stayed away from it, because they knew, right? It wasn't until like a very specific situation that they could use this chord in. They knew that doing it too early would give away the element of surprise, and also it let your opponent know your location too early. And the problem with this chord is that even though it sounds good, and the reason why it's situational is because the 7th, 9th, 11th, and 13th of C minor 7 is B flat, this is the 7th, 9th is D, the 11th is F, and the 13 is A. So if you play that 13 and your A is already in the C minor, that's it. Your enemy knows where you are. That chord is only good on certain maps. That's it. That chord is good on certain maps. It's basically good on one. It's good in one meta. So if you can always start like kind of a private, if you want to do like a private battle with other members, who really want to go back and play that old meta, right? Basically like the 6.0 meta. If you want to go back and play that 6.0 meta, you can do that. But the minor 13 chord is very specific, and you got to be careful how you use it, because if you just play out in the wild, in any other tune that uses the bebop meta, right? We're in kind of a post-bop, neo-bop meta. We kind of are doing a renaissance back to that when we're talking about tune writing now. If you do that with the person who is playing the current meta, you're going to get snuffed out. You're going to get snuffed out because everyone knows how to punish that. It's going to get punished. The 13th always constantly gets punished. But it's a good sounding chord that's really cool if you want to use it in that situation, in that meta. So that's why the minor 13 is down here. So let's go. That's the only chord that's here. These two tiers are basically here to show you why the meta is what it is, right? This chord has always just been kind of weak. It's always been not bad, but it's so limited. And this chord is just very situational. It's very situational only on certain maps. Okay, so now we're gonna go into the first tier that has more than one chord in it. Let's talk about the usable but limited function section of the chord tier list. So again, this is ordered. So we're gonna talk about these chords and how they work within the context of the jazz meta. So in the jazz meta, we've seen a lot of patch updates. We've seen a lot of different decisions, a lot of bugs. We've seen a lot of decisions that musicians over time have used in order to achieve their goal, right? Especially when it comes to different team comps. It's important to innovate. It's always important to innovate in the meta because you want to keep things changing. You want to keep things moving. But there are also some chords that are staples and some chords that have kind of bounced around throughout the metas. So I guess to clarify, there are some chords from some chords have just been unchanged, right? Some chords have been kind of unchanged in the meta since the 1.0, 2.0 patch. But there's some chords back then that have lost their power because of the introduction of these chords that we're going to talk about right now, actually. So let's first talk about the major 7. This is the first chord in a usable but limited function. So all chords in this tier are chords that are cool. You can build a comp here. Like they're going to be fine. They can stand alone. However, the problem with this tier, right? If we're going to talk about the limited, why is it limited? Well, you obviously can know that major 7 is usable. It's like, it's super standard, right? But limited function. Let's talk about why it's limited. So if you look at the properties of a major chord, just the triad, from a triad perspective, if you look at a B flat major, for example, I guess I'm going to be talking to B flat this whole stream. B flat major has 1, 3, and 5, major 3. So that means B flat, D, and F. Without any 7th, that chord can kind of go anywhere. It's good. Without the 7, the major chord can kind of be anything. It can be used as a dominant, right? For example, if you're in B flat major, and you want to use only triads. If you're in the triad only meta, which was like the first meta, right? The first meta where 7ths were like really kind of super situational. In the ragtime meta, dominants were kind of like, this chord was kind of hovering around, right? This chord was kind of hovering around the tiers for a good amount of time. No one really knew how to use it. It was too early in the meta. It was too, basically this chord was too early. It was too early, right? It was ahead of its time. So triads were safe. They were the safe pick. 7ths were basically too wild for the ragtime meta at a certain time. So the people who really skill diffed other composers with the 7th chord, like for example Scott Joplin in that era, was of course the most OP player of the ragtime era. He was the cat, right? And he knew how to use 7 chords in a different way than other people knew how to use them at the time. So they were kind of like tricky. So triads were basically the safe pick, super safe. Majors are super safe because it could be anything. If you're in B flat major, you can have a B flat major 1, or you can have a 5, which is F A C, right? And that's a dominant chord, as in the dominant. The 5th degree of the scale is the dominant, right? So even without a 7th, the major triad can still work. It's been used since the beta days, right? From when jazz was being beta tested in the 1700s, or in the 1600s, like 1600s, 1700s, like Baroque, high classical, when jazz was being beta tested, right? Even back then, people already understood that, wow, this chord can work. So that's been used since the beginning, even pre-patch, pre 1.0, right? Like 0. Whatever those days. But here's the problem. When you put a 7th on the major chord and you put if you put a dominant 7, of course that 5th retains its function. When you put a major 7, well, now you have something extremely limited, because now once you put the major 7, you have now a note that can only be used in certain contexts, because the major 7 of B flat is an A. Well, here's the problem with the A. The A is also the 3rd of F, the dominant. So as a result, you can't really use this chord. The chord can't move around different keys it can't move around different tonic centers within a key. If you put a B flat major 7, sounds great. That's B flat, D, F, and A. However, what happens when you go to the 5th degree with the major 7? Well, now you have F, A, C, and E natural. That rubs against the fundamental, the 7th of an F7, which is used, of course, we know 7's like the result of 3rds. So if you put a major 7th on the 5th degree, it's immediately punished. It's immediately punished, So that's the only reason why this chord is kind of limited, because this chord sounds great and you can resolve to it. It's a good sound, but you don't want to move this chord around too much. If you move this chord around too much, then you run into speed limitations, right? This has range limitations, not speed. This has limited range, right? Decent power, decent DPS, but very limited range. So you have to have someone go in with it in order to make sure that survives. It's a good support chord, right? So, but anyway, that's the bottom of the usable limited function. Let's talk about other chords that are in here now. So we're gonna talk about two. I'm gonna combine these chords into one, because even though I can talk about them separately, I'm gonna talk about them together. So these chords can be kind of interchangeable, but they kind of have the same function. So let's talk about the dominant 13th and the dominant 9th. So probably didn't see this one coming. Probably didn't see this one coming. The 13th and the 9th are chords that should be up here. They should be up here, right? They should be somewhere, but there's a reason why they're not here, and I'm going to tell you why. I debated putting these chords up here, but one of the main reasons I didn't is because of two glaring flaws, unfortunately. They're not that big of a deal. These chords are not that big of a deal, because they're definitely above major 7, because they're still functional. They have all the properties of 7 chords, which we'll talk about later, which most of you competitive players will understand like how incredible this chord is. They have all the great functionality. However, they have some limitations here because they're locked. It's like, for example, for those of y'all who play Splatoon or Overwatch or any stuff like that, right? The thing that kills a great weapon or a class is having a good sub, bomb, whatever, or special or ult. And unfortunately, these kits are killed by their extensions, the subs. They're killed because if you look at them without the extensions, again, you got a 7th chord. So for those of y'all who might be new to the jazz meta, I'll explain what a 13th and a 9th chord is. These are extension chords, right? If you see a 9 or a 13 or any kind of number without a designator next to it, right? This is like with a major next to it, minor, whatever, augmented, whatever. If you don't see any word next to it, assume that any number is the 7. That's the jazz shorthand, right? It's a 7 plus this. So the problem with these chords is that unlike this chord, right? Unlike this chord, the good old 7 flat 9, which you're going to talk about later, unlike this chord, and the sharp 9 that's not here, unlike this chord right here can't do much. So let's talk about resolutions, right? In the jazz meta, speed is everything. Speed and deception, speed and cunning are everything. You need to be able to resolve quickly. You need to be able to resolve reliably. The problem with the 9th chord is that the 9th doesn't have any chromatic neighbors. So the thing that makes for like a more aggressive comp, like if you want to build an aggressive comp in the jazz meta, you got to have chords that are able to resolve with the least amount of space, right? These chords are too slow. These are examples of chords that, like, again, they're usable because they sound good, but they're heavy. These are heavy chords, which means that they have really nice, deep sounds, but they're too slow to be used by themselves. You can use them. They're not down here because they can be, like, every chord here can be used by itself. However, when it's time to use it in a functional comp, the problem with these chords is that they can be anything. It's kind of hard to find their place on the map. They're kind of scattered. And I'm going to tell you why. In order to have a good, fast, and aggressive comp, which is what this meta demands, you got to have every note that you're trying to resolve needs to have a chromatic neighbor. The reason why 3rds and 7ths are always going to be OP, period, spoiler alert, the reason why they're always going to be OP is because a natural 3rd likes to resolve up, and it can resolve up forever. If you go down the circle of 4ths and you put dominant chords there, you got B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, whatever. 3rds and 7ths are going to constantly go into each other over and over and over again. They can cycle and chain, and if one chord goes down, another one can come in its place. You can expend a B flat 7 into an E flat 7. And you can constantly chain respawns, right? From B flat 7 to an E flat 7 to an A flat 7. If you constantly chain that, eventually going to make your way back, and you will have used no resources because your opponent it's just going to be left hanging. You're going to leave your opponent. You're going to constantly be leaving your opponent at a loss for words. You're going to keep cycling forever, and they'll never know where you're going. So you're deceiving them while also giving them something good to listen to. So 3rds and 7ths are good because they can be used in any comp. Any comp. The reason why I wanted to talk about these chords is because, all right, so if 3rds and 7ths can kind of cycle forever, well, let's talk about the rule, the rock, paper, scissors, right? This is the rock, paper, scissors rule of resolutions. The rule of resolutions is that 3rds like to resolve up, right? So if you're in a B flat, so let's say F7, let's stay in B flat. F7, the 3rd goes up to B flat, which is the 1. And the 7 goes down to the 3rd, which is D, right? So the 7th of F7 is E flat, it likes to go down to D. Every resolution needs a chromatic neighbor. What 7 flat 9 has that 9th does not have is a chromatic neighbor. The flat 9 of F7, right? So if you're talking about F7 flat 9, that's F, A, C, E flat, and then a G flat, or F sharp, I wouldn't say. Let's say G flat because of the rule of resolution. The G flat has the closest chromatic neighbor being the F, so it can go down to the 5th. The flat 9 can resolve down to the 5th naturally. The 9th has to take twice the amount of time to resolve as the flat 9 does. Natural 9 is just not it. Natural 9 is a good sounding chord. This chord, the reason why this is usable is because the 9th and 13th can be used as tonic chords just like a major 7 can. However, they're too slow to be used as reliable fast resolutions like a flat 9 is. That's the unfortunate part. So that's the only reason why they're here. Yeah, so that's kind of the only issue with these chords I have. They're good, but like for example, like a 13th, right? 13th has the same problem. if you stack a chord, stack an F7 to the 13th, right? If you go F, A, C, E flat, G, which is the 9th, and then B, because we always, we sharp the 11 because we don't want to add the root in the chord. Skipping the 11, going to the 13th. The 13th is extremely problematic because even though it sounds good isolated as a tonic, when it comes to being a actual 7th function, the 13th of F is D. That is the third of, not only is it the third, the actual third, which is part of the chord of B flat, but also it has no chromatic neighbor. We don't have a flat 13 on this list for some reason, but the flat 13th is a much more competitive option. So, flat 9, whatever, and spoiler alert, they're going to be up there. Flat 9's going to be up here, as you can tell, because 9th is here, flat 9's going to be here, because it just works better. But flat 13 would also be up there, because flat 13 has more function. It just has more function. It's faster for competitive play. But anyway, okay, so that's basically that. I basically explained those two chords. Let's talk about the last chord in the usable limited function. I wonder if y'all can guess which chord this is. This is going to be really interesting. The last chord that's in this usable but limited function tier list is one that some of y'all might disagree with me on, but that's okay. We're talking about competitive jazz here, and this is a chord that has been heavily debated over the past 100 years, right? That's a very long meta, by the way. It's ridiculous. Like over 100 years, we've been changing metas with patch updates and all sorts of things like that. But in this meta, this chord has been a point of contention for many musicians. Has been constantly, people have been experimenting with how to use this chord in a comp because the problem with this chord is it's extremely strong. We're talking about the minor triad, y'all. Minor triad. Minor triad is the most usable limited chord. This is the most mid, like aggressively mid. I think I heard someone use that recently. This is the most aggressively mid chord in all of jazz meta. It sucks because not it sucks, not the chord sucks, but I'm saying it sucks that it is because I'm telling you, back in listen, from patch 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, right? Ragtime, trad jazz, early jazz big band, right? This chord was up here. I guess kind of here. It was mostly here. I don't think it was really up here, but because it's still very situational, right? But this chord was here back then. It's here now. Do you know why? Because this chord exists. If this chord didn't exist in the meta, the problem is, man, once this chord got patched into the game, once this chord was released, right? Because it was being beta tested for a while, right? You had early adopters like Cole Porter with kind of really, really stretching the, for example, the song "What Is the Thing Called Love," right, from the 20s, very ahead of his time. This chord was really, Biggs Beiderbecke and Frankie Trumbar were also very early adopters of the minor 7, but the minor 7 came out and immediately bumped this chord from A tier to B tier. For some of y'all who may be confused, let me explain. The minor triad has all the same good properties of a minor 7, right? Right? However, what it doesn't have is a 7. It's too slow. It's very heavy. And because it doesn't have a 7, it sticks out too much. The thing about the 7 is that the 7 is almost like stealth. The 7th is very stealthy because you never know when the 7 is going to resolve or become a tonic because it can work as both. Which, again, all the chords in this tier are chords that can be used as both. This chord can't do that. This chord, if you play a minor triad, like a straight up C minor triad or F minor triad, whatever, you're sticking out like a sore thumb. You're just there. You have to stay there. You can use it in whatever way you want, but the problem is, if you put this chord in the wild, it has a really high explosion and splash damage, but it can't recover fast enough. You have to have something else to pick it up. The minor 7 needs to come in to clean up the mess that minor 7 leaves behind. I mean, that the minor triad leaves behind. It's almost impossible to run a minor in a comp without a minor 7. It comes with the territory. You have to be very bold. You got to skill diff everyone if you're going to play a minor. You got to be bold. The minor triad, I don't know if I just said minor 7 by accident, but the minor triad is the type of chord that you play. You pick in your comp. You pick this chord in your comp because you are confident. You understand the limitations. You understand that it doesn't have a quick resolve 7, right? It doesn't have the same speed. And the problem is you're locking your team, you're forcing your team to play around you. You don't want to be played around you don't want a minor chord to be played around because this chord only works on certain maps. This chord only works in certain situations, also in certain metas, right? Again, the reason why this chord was so OP or good, it wasn't OP, but it was high tier. The reason why minor was a high tier in the 1.0 and 2.0 metas is because people weren't hip to this sound yet. This chord didn't come out yet. It was always hinted at. People always played this chord by accident. But it was very, very tricky to use that in the same way that you would use this chord. This was the strongest resolution. This chord can be used as the reason why it's not down here, right? It's not with the major 7. It doesn't have the problems of a major 7, right? Because it's not locked into a 7th, which is good. So that means that it's not going to have any issues with a major 7 in it. It's not going to have the same third as a 5. You don't want to share thirds with the 5 in a fast comp because you're very limited. So the minor chord, as it is right now, locks your team in this meta. It might change. Who knows? But as we're standing right now, the minor triad is too strong. And because it locks your teammates into that one position, and it locks the other chords into one position, it's very hard to come back without adding a 7th. And as soon as you add a 7th, well, it just becomes this chord. So by itself, it doesn't really do much. It's not at the bottom because it can still be a tonic, which is it shares some properties that some of these chords have. But without a 7th, it's just too slow, and it's also too obvious. It's too obvious. You don't want to give away position to the teammates too early, to the other team too early, right? So that's the usable limited function tier for the competitive jazz meta. So next, let's move on to probably my favorite tier to talk about, because this is the tier where all of these chords can kind of work in solo play. They stand good on their own. They have very solid application, and also they can be used with any chord on the list in combination to create a good solid comp. So this is the solid support / multi-purpose tier, and this is a very exciting tier to talk about. Like I said, because it's these are where the most fun chords basically lie. Now let's go ahead and talk about my favorite chord in this tier. This is my most used chord. I basically use this chord in almost all my comps. I'm basically building a lot of comps around this chord because this chord can be used. You have to really be careful though, because it can be used functionally, which we'll talk about very soon, but it's more used as like a color tone. So let's talk about my favorite chord in this list, which is the bottom of the solid support / multi-purpose tier, the major 7 sharp 11. Why is the major 7 sharp 11 above the major 7? Technically, this chord should have even less application, right? Well, let's talk about inner urge for a second. This chord is one of the only chords in the entire game. Better than this. In the entire meta, this chord is the only chord that validates the half diminished as a standalone tonic. This chord alone, as we've seen in when Joe Henderson came out with it came through. Joe Henderson and Wayne Shorter are like the top players in the post bot meta, right? The kind of 6.2 patch or whatever, 6.1. When that patch was happening, major 7 was the saving grace. This chord coming out made this chord relevant. It's like the problem is I still can't put it in situational because, again, if we're talking about standing by itself, it doesn't do that. This chord does. This chord stands by itself. This doesn't. However, you can put a half diminished on your team if you want to have a half diminished on your team with no 7, right? Because remember, 7 works everywhere. 7 works at every comp. If you can't have a 7th in your comp, right? Like, let's say you don't have enough players and no one can play or whatever. If you have the half diminished with a major 7 sharp 11, you basically saved your team. You saved your comp. If we were in the 6.0 meta, this would be the top of solid support. So let me go and explain why. The reason why this chord is so important is because of the sharp 11. This chord does not have that. Natural 5, right? Like sharp 11 can be interpreted as a sharp 4 if you want. For color, I like to keep the natural 5 sometimes. But the thing is, this chord can be used in a bunch of different ways that this chord can't be used as. For example, this chord can be used as a fake 5. Let's talk about that. Being used as a false 5 in this situation means that if you have, for example, major 7 can be paired up with minor. You can actually pair the major 7 with the minor. You can pair major 7 with half diminished. You can pair major 7 with a minor 13. You can pair it. Yeah, basically this is like minor's best friend. In the 6.0 patch, this chord became extremely OP. Because that sharp 11 allows it to share a 5 with any one of these chords. And being able to share a 5, not share a 5, but share the 5th sound degree. You have so many common tones in this chord with basically everything that it can go with anything. Let's talk about inner urge, right? Let's go back to inner urge. The first chord of inner urge is that terrible low tier chord, F sharp half diminished, right? It's a half diminished. This chord gets validated by going down a half step into F major 7 sharp 11 and then gets cycled. It gets cycled down whole steps. So basically, one of the reasons why this chord is so OP is because with this combination is because if you go up a half step, you get the sharp 11s in the 5th. If you go down a half step, for example, if you're F sharp, half diminished, to a F major 7 sharp 11, well now the B is the 4th of the half diminished. And it almost creates the illusion that this half diminished is actually a minor chord. Because now you can play E pentatonic on this. E pentatonic works. You can play A pentatonic if you want, but E pentatonic is like a better scale for this. And if you just use pentatonic from the major 7, you get a world of application from this chord. So not only does it sound good, it has more options than this because you're not locked in. You can omit the 5th and get way more application than you can with a major 7 chord. This is a great chord. This is one of the only chords on this list that pairs with any of these chords. It's great. It's awesome. It's a great chord. So I spent a lot of time on that, so let's move on a little bit. So next, we're going to talk about a chord that I mentioned earlier, but now we're going to talk about the minor 11. Minor 11 is pretty self-explanatory. I already talked about the problems with the minor 13. The minor 13 is basically an offshoot. It's like it's going too far. The minor 11 is like the perfect stopping point. So actually, the minor 11 is the perfect stopping point. Now you're probably wondering why I didn't deal with the minor 9. I'm gonna get to the minor 9 in a second. However, the minor 9 actually has more application than the minor 11. But yeah, let's talk about why minor 11 is better than minor 13 for competitive play. So for competitive play, remember the 13 in a minor chord has the 3rd of the 5. It resolves too quick. Well, minor 11 takes away that limitation by just removing the hard reed, right? You can't exactly tell where this chord is gonna go. However, it still has one issue. And it's not really an issue. This is more of just like a thing that you can skill diff people into kind of manipulating this around. It has really good applications because it also sounds good by itself. But it still has an 11, which means it potentially, depending on the context, can lock it in to a certain sound, right? It's very mellow, but also that minor 11 is the root of the 5 if you're going to do a resolve. Remember, if you're talking about resolution comps, right? Resolution comp, major 7 sharp 11 is a very niche 7th chord substitute. It very, very, very specific situations, which is none of these chords can do that. None of these chords can substitute 4/7, but this chord can substitute 4/7. Minor 11 can kind of substitute 4/7, but it's not as strong because it has the F. So, for example, if you're in C minor 7, right? C minor 7, so the 7 is B flat, the 9th is D, and the 11th is F. Obviously, it doesn't have these problems, but it does kind of allude to that 5, that potential 5. So you have to be careful how you voice it. Basically, experienced players with this chord will know how to voice it in order to prevent being hard read. So you can kind of stay out of the way, you know. But that's ways there. Not too much to say about that. That's basically what it does. So let's talk about the funniest chord on this list. Sus. All right, so the sus chord is actually my second favorite chord on this list. It's kind of, I don't know, like, not on this list, but in this tier. Major 7 sharp 11 and sus are like kind of my most used chords. If anybody sees like some of the maps that I make, they'll probably notice that like there's a lot of points, there's a lot of high ground. Like it's a lot of elevated sus chords and elevated major 7 sharp 11 pits. So sus is a great chord because this is the kind of chord you want to add to your comp when you want to add, when you want to kind of mix people up, right? It's a great support chord. It's great for kind of creating chaos on the field. If you play Splatoon, your sus chord is basically your tetras, your tetra dualies. If you play Smash, this is basically kind of like your Sheik, right? Sus is kind of Sheik, Fox, super fast characters that are very elusive, that don't do a lot of damage. This chord doesn't, the reason why this chord doesn't do damage, like it's not up here, is because it doesn't have a third. So because it doesn't have a third, even if you add a 7th, it still doesn't have a third. So it kind of mixes your opponent up constantly. This is the mix-up chord, right? Super mix-up chord, but it just doesn't do a lot of damage. So because it doesn't do a lot of damage and it can't resolve very fast, it's stuck down here. But it's a really good chord because this chord is one step away from being this one. It's one step away from being a 7th. But also the cool thing about sus is that if you add a 7th or the thing that it has over the minor, well, for example, the thing that sus has over minor 13 and over dominant 13 and dominant 9th and even over minor 11, whatever, is that it doesn't have a third. So the bad thing turns into an advantage. So basically, these kids got kind of a buff when sus came out. Sus was being used in a different way before, like in the beta days. People didn't really know how to use it. It's like the chord came out, but people didn't really know how to deal with it. They were just like, this is low tier, or it's very situational. Like back in the Baroque and high classical era, this chord was here, or like kind of here. Like you only heard this chord at the end of a song. That's it. Either at the end of the song or like at the end of a phrase, like a half cadence. This chord was used as a substitute for a 2. This was the first 2 chord, right? But ever since, again, we're talking about 6.0. Ever since the 6.0 patch, this chord jumped tiers, skipped 2 or 3 tiers. Sus is incredible. This is an incredible chord, y'all. This is a chord you can use in almost any comp. But again, the reason why it's here and not here is because it's still very situational. 1, because it doesn't have a third. 2, because you got to be careful with how you use it. Because it doesn't have a third, this is one of those chords that it's a glass cannon. It's a glass cannon chord. It's very fast, doesn't do a lot of damage. It also dies really easily because as soon as someone adds a third, you're giving away. So now, if you have like, for example, like a F7 sus or F sus, whatever, F7 sus, F9 sus, whatever. It's very ambiguous as to where that, depending on the other chords around it, depending on who else you have on your team that are doing the work. Whoever's in your comp that, like, whatever chords you got in your comp that are doing the most work and pulling the heavy lifting. For example, you got your minor 11, or maybe, you got your, I'm going to talk about these in a little bit. You got your minor 7s, you got your 7s, you got your, they're doing the heavy lifting, right? Or even some support chords like the ninth, right? Dominant ninth. If this thing right here gets exposed, it dies. It loses all of its function immediately. If you put a major third, it becomes a dominant chord. That's it. It's a glass cannon. It gets killed easily. If you put a minor third, that's it. This chord works best when you're able to kind of zip around the map and mess with people's expectations. That's what this chord does the best. Because you can also create some situations where, like, if you want to create a comp around sus, for example, there are some comps that utilize all sus chords. Very niche comp, and it works on only very specific maps. Very specific. You can also create maps around that use this chord. However, in those types of situations where you're kind of cycling sus chords, they work really well. But only very, very, very situationally, because you can't substitute a chord for a sus. You can't do that because you're taking away the third. And every time you take a third away, you're either slowing down or exposing your comp. That's why this is here. Really nice chord. But it's here. I like it. It's one of my most used chords, but I gotta rank it fairly, unfortunately. So. Okay, so let's talk about the next chord. So, major. As I said before, I kind of spoiled this already, but major is above all these chords. Completely above minor, for sure, 100%. Basically in every way. Major, unlike minor, is not locked into a sound. Major is very powerful, yes, but unlike minor, you can put a major chord in any place that a 7th chord can be put. As long as 7th chords are not in the meta, but the problem is 7th chords are always around, right? They're always there. So, because major chords can be used at any scale degree except for the 2. Well, it kind of can too. Like, that's the thing. It can be, you can substitute this thing for this. You cannot substitute this thing for this. Not always, but like in functionally. We're talking function, right? If we're talking about building a comp around function, which is what you need speed and function, right? If you want to be able to resolve, this thing doesn't do anything, this thing does everything. The fact that it has a major third is like having if you play Splatoon, it's like having a bomb, like having a sub, a lethal, Having a lethal is that third. This third can go anywhere. It doesn't have a 7th, so it's not as fast. However, this chord can be used anywhere. It's not top tier. It's high tier because this chord can be paired with almost any comp. But the problem is, because it doesn't have a 7th, it's very easy to get stuck. It doesn't have a lot of ammo, right? It doesn't have a lot of ammo. and it runs out of speed. It runs out of steam very quickly. And one of the reasons why is because if you're not careful, this chord can overtake your entire comp. It can always get in the way. Major is the type of chord that has to be treated with like people who are able to use major triads like effectively and skill diff everybody else, like that, all the kind of beginner, intermediate, whatever, like advanced players. They're extremely good players. You have to give them respect. You always got to respect people who know how to use this chord. Even people outside of jazz, right? But the thing is, it's a strong chord. It suffers the same problems of not having a seventh as a minor triad does, right? Again, we're talking about the meta. If this was patch 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, this thing would be up here. Everyone knows that. This was the most OP chord because it can be used everywhere, right? But we're not in that meta anymore. We have sevenths. We have this is a seventh meta. This is what it is. So yeah, that's why major chord is here. Not much to say besides the fact that it can be used kind of anywhere. You can use it in the same place you use a 2. Like for example, if you want to do a 2-5-1, you can, like for example, like in My Shining Hour, you can take out the 7 if you really want, right? Like C minor 7, F triad, B flat 7. You can, if you're really adventurous, like you can skill diff people and kind of just F triad the whole thing before going to B flat 7. If you really want, because you can use this can be used as a 2. Major has more function, that's why it's up here, but it's not up here because it's too strong. And you don't want to have a chord like this that slows your comp. There's too much of a liability. So you got to be careful with this. This is a really strong chord, but it has to be used carefully because it's really easy to waste your special with that. Okay, let's talk about the obvious chords. I'm going to put these together, but I already talked about this chord already. We're talking about the minor 7, but we're also talking about the minor 9. Minor 9 is under the minor 7 for obvious reasons. So this chord right here, minor 7 is probably the biggest saving grace for the minor chord. Again, this thing saved the minor chord from being written out of existence because the minor chord was, a lot of people didn't like it. The minor triad was like one of those chords that was like so strong and so slow that people didn't want to have it on the comp. Bebop players didn't want that in their comp. So they started adding extensions to it in order to kind of, remove the weaknesses that a minor triad had. Minor 7 basically removes all of those weaknesses because the minor 7 has a 7th. And the flat 7th allows it to resolve quickly. This is the best support chord. This is the best support chord in the meta, by the way. I'm just going to say that right now. Minor 7 and minor 9. Like the only reason why minor 9 is below minor 7, just a heads up, is because it has a 9th. It has an extension that can give away its position. Like usually the 9 is always, again, we're talking about function, right? Not sound. So if we're talking about function, 7 takes the cake. If you want to add sound, minor 9 and minor 7 are basically interchangeable. Because these days it's hard to find a minor 7 without a 9 in it. Almost every voicing has a 9 in it. The minor 11 is a little more situational because you don't always want to have the root of the next chord coming up. Minor 7 is the best support chord, period. But yeah, I mean, the minor 7 has everything that you want in a support chord. It's able to be used. It can be like if all the other chords go down, basically, right? If the chords in your comp go down and you're kind of just left kind of hanging on this, the minor 7 can stand on its own, right? It's a good, basically in solo or team play, with or without comms, whatever. The minor 7 can work. It's used everywhere. It's widely adopted. Not much to say about it. Like I said, it has a 7, which is a lethal. The reason why it's not up here is because it has a minor 3rd, and a minor 3rd slows it down. So even though it can exist, it can't stack up against these chords or any other chord that's above minor 7. Basically, any other chord. This thing can outplay any of these. This chord outplays minor 9, major, sus, minor 7, minor 7 outplays all of that. Period. Anyone, any skill level for this outplays everything. It's used in every situation. For multiple patches. I mean, we're talking about since patch 4.0, it's never changed. It's only gotten stronger, actually. So, minor 7 is just it's the best support chord in the game, period. So, anyway, okay. So, we have 4 chords left. 4 chords left. You probably already know where one's going, but I don't think you know where the rest of them are going. So, this is the next chord on the list. This is obvious. You knew this was coming. You knew that this was coming. You knew this was going to be at least somewhere on this list this high, right? The 7 flat 9. So there's really not much to say about this besides the fact that, like, you know, this is the first true 7th on the list. The 7 flat 9 has everything that you'd want in a 7. It's a very, very strong chord. This is one of those chords that kind of just like, it's another one of those chords that's everywhere. This chord saw use in a different way that we're gonna see later. I'm not gonna spoil it, but this chord has properties of 2 chords, which make it good and versatile, but it also has another problem. It has properties of 2 chords. The problem with the 7 flat 9 is that it has the properties of the 7th chord and a diminished chord. So because it has properties of 7th and diminished together, it's too clunky to work for every single situation. This is the type of, you can always substitute this for most situations. However, that flat 9 is gonna put you, it's gonna stick you out. It's gonna stick you out in the open. Most of the time you can use it as a substitute for any 7th chord, but functionally the flat 9 kind of locks you in. The difference between a flat 9 and a natural 9, however, though, is that you can always kind of, you know, if you want to, for example, you can be a decoy, right? The good thing about the flat 9 is that you can resolve to a major chord. That's awesome. You can resolve to a major chord if you want. However, the flat 9 is still a flat 9. So the fact that it's a flat 9 means that it also shares properties with a half diminished chord. That's a problem. It doesn't have the problems of a half diminished chord where it's like it has the flat, you know, a flat 3, but it does share the flat 5 with the half diminished chord. So because it shares a flat 5, this is one of those chords that you kind of use carefully. Not every map can use a 7 flat 9. You can substitute most chords for that. However, you got to be tasteful. So I would say that most players kind of at the lower skill bracket are not really familiar with how to use this chord, because this chord often gets paired up with a sharp 9 as well, which for all intents and purposes, sharp 9 is closer to the bottom of this list because we don't have it up here, but it's not down here because it's still a 7. But 7, flat 9, and sharp 9 are usually interchangeable functionally. So, but again, not much to say here. It has a 3rd that goes anywhere. It has a 7 that goes anywhere. The flat 9 just kind of locks it into a sound. So because the flat 9 locks it into a sound, you got to be careful how you use it. That's basically it. It's just still really good. All right, we got one more chord in the solid support multi-purpose. Which one do you think it's going to be? I can tell you right now, I already know which one it's going to be, because this chord right here, this chord's been OP, basically, not OP, it's not OP, it's definitely not OP, unfortunately, it's not OP. However, this chord was OP in patch 2.0. You basically couldn't find anything. In 2.0 and 3.0, this chord was basically OP tier. But since the meta has moved on and people kind of like, you know, moved on to different applications, different chords, whatever, different play styles, because the play styles changed, the chord also changed. So we're going to talk about the augmented chord. Top of this solid supports multi-purpose. While the minor 7 is the strongest support, chord, augmented has the highest DPS out of all these chords, basically. You know, it basically it has the high. It's ridiculous. Augmented has, all right, I don't want to spoil it, but basically, like, I'm not going to spoil the order, but augmented has something that, this is the first thing that we see with the diminish, actually. We see this with diminish as well. Augmented has really interesting properties that none of these chords have, is that this is the first time we see a chord that can camouflage itself as more than one chord. Insane. Unbelievably, if diminish didn't exist, this thing would be overpowered, because during patch 2.0, you couldn't get around it. Not only can you substitute any one of the chords in here for another chord that's around the key, you can also use this chord as a 5. Yeah, man, augmented is OP. It's not OP, but it's extremely strong. OP is extremely strong, because as soon as you add a 7, well, now you have the flat 5, which is also a flat 13. So they have 2 resolution points. And then if you look at the augmented chord, for example, B flat augmented, B flat, D, F sharp, B flat, you have a cycle. The augmented chord is what allowed for like the final pioneer of patch 5.0, John Coltrane. He was kind of like the last person that kind of before 6.0 got ushered in. Once Giant Steps and all of a sudden the Train Changes came out, this chord shot up. It was always here, but believe it or not, after beat, like, here's the thing. This is the one chord that basically has constantly been, it was in danger. This chord was kind of in danger of being written out. I'm going to say that right now. With the advent of 5.0, this chord was looking a little, it was kind of going like, it's all right. It can be used. Because here's the thing, patch 1.0, 2.0, right? 1.0 is like ragtime, early jazz, right? And then 2 is Dixieland, what is it? Dixieland and New Orleans jazz. Sorry, I'm getting a little tired. And 3.0 was big band swing, right? Now, this chord was always solid. Bebop basically cemented this thing. If this chord was kind of here at some point, Bebop made it here. This chord can be used as a 5 for a minor chord. It can be used as a 5 for a major chord. Both. So it has all the good properties of a major chord, but it also has that interesting flat, sharp 5/flat 13. This joint is ridiculous. So when the 5.0 patch came in, everybody was playing a slower meta. It was kind of an interesting meta. Everyone was playing slower, basically. It's like less resolutions. It was the kind of first no resolution meta, right? Kind of blue basically ushered in the era of like, hey, maybe we should stop playing with 7th chords for a little bit. Like we don't have to always resolve. Let's do a resolutionless comp, and it resulted in a very slow meta that actually allowed play styles like free jazz to actually enter the meta as well. But the augmented chord was on its way out, and then John Coltrane right before 6.0. You could almost say he ushered in 6.0 if you want, but basically with his discovery that you could get away from the cycle of fourths and move through thirds instead, that kind of changed everything. Because, unfortunately it was, that meta kind of, it kind of locked out a lot of lower level players, unfortunately. So this is a chord you kind of didn't really see in casual play that often. You mostly saw this chord in high level play. But Coltrane's like discoveries about like the triangle resolutions, it kind of made this chord relevant again. That saved this chord. And it made everybody realize that, wow, there's like things we can do with this chord that are hyper meta. Way beyond the meta. It's kind of ridiculous. But the only reason why this chord is not up here is because of one chord that is going to start off the OP S tier. Diminished. Diminished is just one of the greatest chords to ever exist. So everything I just said about augmented, diminished does it with no limitations. Every chord in this tier, basically, right? I'm just gonna put them here. Oh well, I'm not. Well, you already know since diminished at the bottom, 7th at the top. So we can talk about these two. So these chords up here are chords that in solo play, they dominate everything, right? Nothing can compete with these chords. You can run a comp of just these two chords and be fine. You don't even, like, you got to be careful with this one. The reason why this is not the best chord in the meta and why this is because this can't work. This doesn't always work as a tonic, but it's the best resolution chord in the game. Nothing can compete with the power that this chord has, because the thing about diminished chords that I like to say is that diminished chords are kind of like the Times Square, Grand Central Station, whatever. It's like that one, that's what we like to say in jazz theory, right? That diminished chord is basically, every train runs through that station, right? You can go to the diminished station and go to any station. You can go from any station ever, any one of these stations, and come back to diminished station, right? And the reason why is because of the way the cycle of fourths work. Cycle of fourths or fifths, whatever. So the cycle of fourths is extremely important to understand here, because that's the reason why 7th chords are OP. But the thing about a diminished chord in relation to the cycle of fourths is that the diminished chord, like the augmented, goes forever. However, the augmented chord only has 3 resolutions. And because it only has 3 resolutions, it's not symmetrical. It's odd. It's 3. Diminished has 4 resolutions, which means that every single one of those, every single note in a diminished chord can go to another note. That's insane. That broke the meta. And this chord, diminished and augmented, basically are the only chords that have existed from patch 1.0 and kind of just never went away, right? These chords diminished was a little, unlike unlike now, right? In the beta days, when they were beta testing jazz, this chord was really kind of, it was hard, right? But as soon as ragtime came through and early jazz came through, diminished was everywhere, right? All the most popular songs had a diminished chord in it. Diminished chord can be used for tension, it can be used for resolution, it can be used for anything. What I was about to say with the 7 flat 9 and why the 7 flat 9 is down here but diminished up here is because, hey Pat, wait a minute. If you look at a diminished, isn't the third, 5, 7, and 9 of a 7 flat 9 the same as diminished? Yeah, but here's the problem. 7th has a root. The 7th has a root. So because the 7th has a root, and because it clashes with the flat 9, it only has one place it can go. That's the reason why this chord is great, but the flat 9 locks it into place. The diminished, if you have, like, for example, a C, I'm gonna make a video about this, by the way. If you have a C diminished 7, C diminished 7 is C, E flat, F sharp, and A. The cool thing about a diminished chord is that you can start anywhere on any note, and it's the same chord. It's the same property that augmented has. The augmented is B flat, D, F sharp, and then back to the top, right? Well, the problem is that you can't really do a lot with this. Altogether, you can stack it, but you can't put the chord in any position. Well, you can put the chord in any position here, right, and it'll still work the same. But the problem is it's built in thirds, and this is built in fourths. So when I say built in thirds, I don't mean like the both of them have major and minor third applications, right? This is augmented is based off of major thirds, this is based off of minor thirds, but there are 4 resolution points and 3 resolution points here. So those 4 resolution points mean that, for example, this chord can be substitute for this chord can be substitute for that. Diminished can be substituted for any 7th, and as a result, these two go together like peanut butter and jelly. There's really no chord that can really beat a diminished chord. So if we talk about, for example, let's put it head to head with some other chords, right? What does diminished have over half diminished? Half diminished has a 7. That 7 locks it. The 7 locks it into place, and without, and because this has a 7th that locks it into place without a third that can combo off of anything, it's kind of stuck. And that flat 5th basically means that it ain't going nowhere. It sticks out. Diminished fixes every single problem with the half diminished by adding, by lowering something unprecedented, right? Like, who would think of that? This chord was fine. You did not have, this is an example of like patching, like half diminished is basically a patch for diminished. This chord didn't need to exist. It really didn't need to exist. They didn't have to raise the 6th. But because this has the 6, it fixes every problem that a half diminished has. Insane. It fixes every problem because it has all the properties of a 2, right? It has like a C, right? It has a C and the F sharp, just like this has, and it has an E flat. Same thing. But because it has an A, this thing can disguise itself as a 7th chord. You don't even need a 7th. If you're looking for pure function, right? Pure function, this chord beats it all. And the same thing you can do with augmented, like if you want to like change the roots, like do B flat like for example, building chords off of augmented resolution. So you're talking about B flat major 7, or sorry, B flat, D, F sharp, B flat 7, D7, F sharp 7, whatever. Diminished does that and better. You can do all minor chords. This thing is a shotgun of minor chords. You can do somebody talked about the bare hairs concept, but there's a concept that was started in the 4.0 patch that made it, again, it's the skill diff to the lower level players. It was just unfair, right? You can if you take all the roots, right? Sorry, if you take all the notes of a diminished 7 chord, so C, E flat, F sharp, and A, and you treat every note as a root, as its own tonic, whew, you treat every note as its own tonic, and you put a minor triad there, or a minor 7 there, if you go up to the 3rd degree, you can resolve anywhere to any one of these minor or major chords. Insane. There's a common phrase that's used in the 4.0 meta, right? Right? That type of sound. The reason why that sound works so well is because, I'll do a video on this later because I can't really use that here. But basically, if you look at the minor chords within a diminished cycle, if you look at what's related, for example, C diminished, right? C diminished as a substitute for F7. In a minor 7, the best support chord in the meta. In a C minor 7, the C minor 7 is basically a sus of the F, right? C minor 7 is basically F7 sus, but without the strong tendencies that without the glass cannon properties of a sus chord. The 2 minor sets up the 5. With the diminished chord, you don't even need a 2. That's crazy. With the diminished chord, you don't even need a 2. It's insane. It's actually kind of insane. It's actually kind of insane. So you can't. The other thing is that you don't need a 2, but it also works really well with a 2. You can actually turn a minor 7 into a diminished chord, or a half diminished into a diminished chord, by just lowering 2 scale degrees. You can only need to lower 1 scale degree with a half diminished, like lower the B flat to an A. Minor 7, you lower the G to a G flat and a B flat to an A. It resolves into itself. It resolves into itself. So if you look at the minor chords, right? C minor 7. Let's look at all the notes that work in F7, right? In order to understand a diminished chord, you got to understand all the words. You got to understand all the chords within a diminished. It's an explosion. This thing has all these chords in it. That's why it's so OP. If you look at diminished and what the innovations that the melee patch, basically the bebop patch, which is the melee, right, of competitive jazz. If you look at what they innovated, what they discovered, and why that patch was introduced, is that if you look at the notes that are in common with an F7, right, what does C minor have in common with F7? Okay, a C minor triad, C, E flat, and G. So the 1 of C minor, so 1, 3, 5 of C minor, which is C, E flat, and G, is the 5, 7, 9, right? The ninth chord of an F7 or F9, whatever. Now, if you go up a diminished, let's go up a diminished. So you got E flat. If you go up a minor third, right, which is what diminished is built up in minor thirds. If you go up a minor third to the next diminished, you have E flat, G flat, and B flat. B flat is one of those notes because, again, like it's kind of weird. We kind of omit that, right? We kind of omit the B flat because, I mean, you can use the B flat if you want to stay on the 2 side. But again, you have options. If you want to play B flat, then you're stuck in half diminished land. But you can omit it. Some people like to omit it. It's just like a passing sound. But let's look at what notes that this has in common, that E flat minor has in common with F. Okay, it has the 1, 3, 5 of E flat minor is what? E flat, G flat, and B flat. Okay, the 1 and the 3 of E flat minor is the 7th and flat 9 of F7, which is F, A, C, E flat, and G flat. So that works. You can keep going. Go another diminished. Let's go up to G flat or F sharp, however you want to see it. The 1, 3, 5 of F sharp or G flat, I'll just say G flat just to make things easier. It's like the 1, 3, 5 of G flat minor is G flat A and C and D flat, or F sharp A and C sharp. Okay, well now let's start getting some really spicy extensions. Let's talk about what notes does it have in common with the extensions of a 7 chord. Sorry, let me move that back. Well, the 1, 3, 5 of G flat is the flat 9, third, and flat 13 of an F7. You got F, A, C, E flat. Then if you want to, then you can do flat 9, which is G flat, and then the third, whatever, or 10th, and then the flat 13, which is C sharp. That's 3 chords in 1. Are you serious? That's 3 chords in 1, bro. You can't. None of these chords can compare. Augmented can't do that. Because let's look at augmented. Let's analyze augmented for a second. If you want to do minor, right? If you want to do the minor cycle for dominant chords and augmented, okay, let's talk about B flat minor, right? Or sorry, not B flat, C minor. Okay, good. C minor's good. Same thing. That's the 1, 3, 5 of C minor is the 5, 7, 9 of F. Go up and augmented. What do you get from C minor? E minor. We already lost. You already lost. If you try to do that, you're not getting anywhere. Because if you go up an augmented, which is built in major thirds, the major third from C is E. You already lost. You already lost because you can't resolve. You got this chords problem now. Why? Because the 1, 3, 5 of E minor, which is E, G, and B, is what in a F7? E, you already lost because the E is natural now. There's no more chromatic neighbor. You have solidified the chord into this function. You've locked your comp down. G is okay, but you can't mess with the 7th. Otherwise, your comp is done. It doesn't go anywhere. The only saving grace of that would be the B. But again, because that seventh is gone, you lose the function. So you can't even do that. So augmented can't do that. And then if you want to just for, you can maybe use the, if you want to go up, C, E, and the A flat. Oh my goodness. A flat already has all the problems, right? A flat is just extensions. So augmented can't do what diminished does. So even though it looks like it can, being built in major thirds as opposed to minor thirds kills this chord. So diminished is OP. Diminished is extremely OP. Now we got to talk about the seventh. So as you already know, I keep talking about seventh, and I keep talking about seventh because it's well known that this is the best chord in the meta. It's been the best chord in the meta ever since patch 2. Not even since patch 2. I mean, like, I guess it's been the best chord in the meta since patch 4. But even, yeah, I mean, like, this kind of chord was kind of being utilized a little bit, but people were they didn't really know how to use it. It took players like, like when Bird, Diz, Monk, and Bud Powell came along, they innovated that. They had to look at what other people did and say, this is too slow. We got to speed up the game. So they sped up the game by learning how to use 7 chords in creative ways, right? The 7th chord has a couple of things going for it. Let's talk about the obvious. The first is that it has a 3rd and a 7th that resolves everywhere. It cycles. This chord cycles into itself, which means that this chord can function as both a tonic and a 5 and a dominant. This can function as a tonic and dominant. People didn't know that in patch 2.0 yet. People didn't really understand that. They kind of did. They were the ones that were the first people that to bring that up about the tonic part, but they were a little hesitant to use it as a dominant. It wasn't until like the end of patch 2.0 when people started doing that. Like, like Louis Armstrong, Big Spider Beck, Fletcher Henderson, Duke Ellington, they really utilized the 7th in the application of a function way better than people who came before them. But let's also talk about something that this chord has over every other chord in the game. And this is the reason, I'm going to tell you right now, the thing I'm about to say about this is the reason why patch 4.0 skill diff everybody else. And if you didn't understand this concept, you basically were locked out of high-level competitive play. We're talking about the tritone. The tritone is the thing that makes this chord OP more than anything else. So the fact that it can be used as a tonic, as in like, you can play funk with like a C7, you can play a blues with a C7, you can play whatever, right? This thing also has a tritone sub function. The tritone substitution, everybody, is what makes this chord the best chord, and it defeats everything else. You try to tritone sub any one of these other chords, nothing's really going to happen. This one kind of, but again, like once you tritone sub, there's no point in doing a tritone sub of a 7 flat 9 because the flat 9 is just the 5th of the tritone. So there's no point. Like, it's okay. Tritone sub here basically means you unlock extreme DPS, unpunishable DPS, by the way. Yeah, unpunishable DPS. You get an extra damage. It's a free damage boost. And you get immediate special, immediate ult constantly. For those of y'all who don't or not too familiar with a tritone, basically the tritone is the midway point between 2 octaves. It's the exact halfway point between 2 octaves, right? And so if you have F1 and F8, whatever, like in terms of scale degrees, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, between 2 Fs, the exact midway point in semitones was 12 semitones. So the 6th semitone is a B. So the B, if you play a B7 and an F7, well, guess what? You just doubled your comp's power. Why? Because anything you can play in the root, you can play in the tritone with extra power. Because the tritone share, because it's in the direct middle, the direct midway point between 2 octaves, they share a 3rd and a 7th. So as soon as you put the 3rd and the 7th, like for example, F7 has a 3rd is A, and the 7th is E flat. The tritone of F is B. B7 has a 3rd of E flat and a 7th of A. That's crazy. Why is that crazy? Because you can have the exact same function, but now you have an extra damage boost that no one can compete. It breaks shields instantly. The tritone subs break every shield, period. Now, some people don't like it. You got a lot of casuals, right? Like in casual play, people complain about tritone subs all the time. In casual play, people talk about tritone subs as being, like too, like you're being too advanced. Like you're too much. You're too heady. Too much. Too much theory. You one of them theory guys. Too much book, all this kind of stuff. It's like jazz school and also whatever. There's a lot of casual players that unfortunately don't understand the usefulness of a tritone sub, and they end up thinking that it's just kind of out of the league. They get skill dips constantly. It's okay. You don't have to use it. Some casual players love it. Some casual players love the OP nature. Like, you know, some people love, like, you know, just busting out like a hammer and just, you know, destroying everyone in Smash if you're playing with items or something. But tritone sub is the wave shine for melee of chords. It gets to a certain point where, like, in top level play, if you can't utilize a tritone sub, you're gonna get knocked out of bracket immediately. If you look at all the notes in a B7, let's look at the notes in a B7 and see how they relate to an F7, for example. So F7 is F, A, C, E. B7 is B, E flat, F sharp, and A. So we isolated the third and seventh. Is the same, right? E flat being the seventh of F, which is also the third of B. A, which is the third of F, seventh of B. So those notes are in common. But what about the fifth and the root? So because they're opposites of each other, the one of B, right? The one is the sharp 11 of F7. The fifth of B is F sharp, which is the flat 9 of F7. So those are great. And if you keep doing extensions, okay, cool. So let's talk about B7, B9, right? Let's talk about B9. The ninth of B is C sharp, which is the flat 13th of F. The problem with that, if you use those chords as standalone chords, right? Like you equip your comp with those chords, you still have good function, but you're locking yourself into the sound. It's really important for comps to have good defense as well as having good offense. You don't want to have too much offense. A comp without, that's the reason why this chord is so OP, because sevenths have offense and defense stats overtuned. The fact that it's a seventh with no extensions, right? You can add any extension to it. But if you add a flat 9, or if you add a natural 13th or a 9th, well, you're making the chord too heavy. You don't want to make the chord too heavy if you're talking about functional comp. This chord by itself needs to stand by itself in order to have extreme function. So going back to my example, all of those extensions that I listed, like for example, just going up to the ninth in B, just going to the ninth gives you all the fancy, colorful extensions of an F7. Here's the problem. Well, not the problem, but the cool thing that happens and why you have to kind of understand how to utilize the chords and utilize the tritone sub. The sharp 11 of B is the 1 of F. The sharp 11 of F is the 1 of B. So you kind of cycle your way back, right? And of course, the natural 13 of B is the flat 9 of F. So you have all those options available to you at will. You don't want to start off with those options. If you start off with those options, then you've wasted your resources, which is the reason why 7, flat 9, and all the other extensions are kind of below 7th. But the 7 can also work as a tonic, because here's the thing. 7 flat 9 cannot work as a tonic. Why? 7 flat 9 ends up getting the same problems as a half diminished 7. Committing to the flat 9 means you've committed to a function. So this is a really good chord, but you committed to function, right? The flat 9 must resolve. This is not a tonic chord. This is a tonic chord. This is a tonic chord. This is a tonic chord. So the reason why 7th is so OP is because this can be all of this if it wants to. But this cannot be this. This cannot be this. This cannot be this. Period. So that's basically the reason why. I mean, there's so many different applications for 7 chords that you can apply, you know. And in history, we've seen that these two chords, diminished a little bit different. The reason why diminished stays relevant is because people moved away from the sound of diminished. Well, for example, there's things I didn't talk about with diminished, right? Diminished, you can, as a triad, works really well, but a diminished 7 also works really well. Diminished major 7 is another beautiful sound that can work. That means that the diminished major 7 can be used from the flat third. So diminished can be used from the flat third. Diminished major 7 can also be used as a transition chord from a lot of different points in a key. So some people use diminished major diminished major 7 as a tonic. Some people are that bold, but this is a very underutilized chord in the later meta for that reason. So because people started moving away from the sound, but people started moving into the function, it basically cemented this chord. Let me rephrase that. Basically, once people figured out that this chord can be used functionally instead of just sonically, because that's the thing, like in casual play, you know, you don't have to worry about function. It's all about sound. Sonic function is the best. But for competitive play, people needed to find out how to use this thing functionally. So when people found the function of this chord, it basically cemented itself for the rest of time. So diminished, I can't see diminished ever really leaving the meta until we enter if we go back into like I don't know, if we go back into 5.0, like brawl, like casual meta, this chord might go down again like it did. Like diminished and augmented were kind of like down in situational during the 5.0 patch, but because we're not in that meta anymore, 7th and diminished aren't going anywhere. 7th is used widely in so many different applications. It's even bled its way into other genres too. Like, you know, the 7th chord is basically OP. So, but anyway, everybody, that is the tier list. If you have any disagreements, that's okay. Again, this is just from my experience as a competitive jazz player. Again, for casual play, you can use any of these chords however you want. You want to put a sus into a 9th, into a half diminished, into augmented, to, you know, whatever, that's fine. Do whatever you want. Like, you should never follow comp as your, like, you shouldn't look at comp as the end all be all, right? Because that's the important thing about jazz is that, you know, people realize that jazz is a thing it's music that's supposed to be listened to. It makes us happy. You know, the reason why we talk about competitive is because we're talking about what wins the most games. And by wins the most games, we mean what puts the most butts in seats at a concert. And major going into half diminished into sus into major 7 sharp 11 to 7 flat 9 doesn't put butts in seats. That's very situational, right? It's extreme. That's casual play. That's for the jam session to experiment. But if you want to win games, meaning you want to get butts in seats and you want to make some money and you want to be successful as a jazz musician, this is the competitive meta right now. This is the competitive meta. So yeah, if you have any thoughts about what I just did, you know, go ahead and leave your comments and let's talk about it. Let's get the conversation started. What do you think are your OP/solid, usable, situational, whatever, 2-week by itself chords? What do you think are the strongest chords for you in your tier list? Or do you agree with me? Cool. Do you think things should be changed? Do any chords need a nerf? Should we buff any chords? You know, like, what can we do to have diminished to make it better? We have no idea. No one knows what the meta is going to be like in the next few years, next decades, or for the rest of the time. But as we know right now, this is where the meta stands, and it's a pretty good meta. And I think that if you want to change or do whatever, you know, you could easily influence the meta by exploring and trying things that are not in the meta as well. Always make sure to have fun and to basically play what makes you happy at the end of the day. But that's it. All right. Thanks for watching this video. I appreciate y'all very much. If you want to see more stuff like this, leave me some comments about what other tier lists I should do later. This video might have been longer than I expected it to be, but thanks for watching, and I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks.